Thousands of American troops are heading to Russia's backyard as Vladimir Putin masses soldiers, tanks, and artillery on Ukraine's border with no sign of backing down. President Biden deploying about 3,000 U.S. troops to Poland and Romania, two NATO allies. Poland shares a border with Russia, and Romania is Ukraine's neighbor. The White House says this is a defensive move to reassure our NATO partners that the U.S. has their back, no matter what Putin decides to do. Russia is calling for the deployments, or calling the U.S. deployments, unfounded and destructive, and insisting it will only fuel military tensions. Meanwhile, Russian forces are holding joint military exercises in Belarus. That is Russia's close ally on Ukraine's northern border. Russia denies it has any plans to invade, but Putin has essentially encircled Ukraine. His troops are almost all the way around multiple fronts. The reason the Belarus deployment is so concerning to the Americans and the rest of the West is that that country's border is near Kyiv. That's Ukraine's capital city. There are new satellite images out that show the massive Russian military buildup. They are ballistic missile vehicles in Belarus. We have pictures of them from Sunday. In the south, in Crimea, the chunk of Ukraine that Putin invaded and essentially stole back in 2014, we can see from the satellite pictures a sea of tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles that are used to carry infantry into battle. So that suggests that there is acceleration. And we reported just days ago that the Russians have also moved blood to what amounts to the front line. Nothing's gone over the border as far as we know, but everything they might need to carry out a war is now there. And to Ukraine's east, on the Russian soil, there are battle groups assembled at a military training ground. Now, the United States and our NATO allies have made it perfectly clear they're pushing for a diplomatic resolution. The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, had a phone call today with President Putin of Russia, and during that call, he warned him that any invasion of Ukraine could be a tragic miscalculation. That's a quote. The Kremlin mocked Johnson after the call and said he was utterly confused. Now, President Biden has said he has no intention of sending any American forces into Ukraine itself. The question is, what will happen next from the Russians? Let's turn to the retired four-star naval officer, Admiral James Stavridis, now for some context. He's the former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO and a senior NBC News international security and diplomacy contributor. Admiral, it's good to see you as always. So now we're sending 3,000 troops, U.S. troops, to Poland and Romania. None going into Ukraine, the president insists. But this movement, is it the right move, both militarily and diplomatically?
I think it is, Shep. And let's start with the military capability here. These are not just sort of 3,000 random U.S. troops. These are from the legendary 18th Airborne Corps, our most heavily blooded unit in modern American history, came out of Afghanistan and Iraq. These are very highly trained combat troops. They'll connect with our allies' forces, with our own U.S. Army forces already stationed in Europe. And it's a means to show the Russians that we are very serious about defending NATO's borders. So it's about reassuring our NATO allies. I think it's an effective military and diplomatic move. But
not provocative, such that it might push Putin to do something he might not otherwise not do.
Yeah, I think it's highly calibrated in that sense, Shep. And let's face it, you know, life is compared to what? And compared to 130,000 Russian troops, as you laid out beautifully a moment ago, 3,000 troops is sufficient to signal resolve, but doesn't cross the threshold of stumbling into a war with Russia. I think it's the right move.
Admiral Stavridis, what additional military pressures, if any, should the president be considering?
Well, you know the Admiral's going to say this, but the Black Sea to the south is a place where we could send some of our destroyers. They could provide intelligence, cyber support, general show of support to our NATO allies that border that Black Sea. Number two, Shep, I'd say cyber. We know the Russians are going to cross that border, not just with tanks, but with electrons and bits, ones and zeros. They're going to try and dismantle the Ukrainian command and control. Providing cyber security, I think, is going to be very important as well. And then third and finally, getting in the hands of the Ukrainian military, and I know them well, they will fight, they're very proud, get them the Javelin missiles for anti-armor, the Stinger missiles for anti-air, give them the tools, the Ukrainians will fight and fight hard.
We talk about Putin invading, but there are a lot of different looks that an invasion can take on. That said, what would an invasion of any kind look like from a NATO perspective?
From a NATO perspective, we're going to see first and foremost that cyber attack. Secondly, watch for Russian naval assets to complete that encirclement in the Black Sea. Then you're going to see the tanks, the shock troops going forward. This is the 8th Guards Army, a legendary Russian unit from World War II. They will cross that border. The question, Shep, is how far are they going to go? My bet, they stay in southeast Ukraine, where there's a lot of pro-Russian sentiment. Many ethnic Russians live in that area. The further to the west they push, the more concerned NATO is going to become. Concerned
is one thing, but if they start knocking out power grids and making things difficult, either for the Ukrainians or potentially for others within NATO, you know, a strike on one is a strike on all. Is there a risk of escalation just in the cyber realm that could see an American city or a pipeline or an electric grid shut down?
Unfortunately, that is absolutely correct. And you are right that in the NATO charter, an attack on a NATO member, which Ukraine is not, but an attack on a NATO member, for example, your point, a cyber attack would require the alliance to respond collectively. And at the moment, the Biden administration is gathering the private sector finance, the transportation grid, the electric side of the house, all of those critical infrastructure, private sector elements are working with U.S. Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, and other cyber actors in the United States for exactly that reason. We're concerned this could broaden. Russia could attack us using cyber.
Admiral Stavridis, thanks so much.